Inside this room, all of my dreams become realities, and some of my realities become dreams.
What in the wide, wide world of sports is going on here? Alive! It's alive! It's alive!
You are listening to The Wilder Ride, getting wilder by the minute. Here are your hosts, Alan Sanders and Walt Murray.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Wilder Ride, getting wilder by the minute, a podcast where we break down and celebrate the films of Gene Wilder 1 minute at a time. Our inaugural season, we are breaking down Young Frankenstein. I'm Alan Sanders, one of your hosts.
And I'm Walt Murray, the other host.
And it is my great pleasure to welcome a guest to our show this week. We have got Susan Delmonico of SJD Health and Fitness. Welcome to The Wilder Ride.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start, and we're going to let everybody know that we are on minute number 11, and it starts with Brainy Smurf asking a story or asking about something to do with vermicelli, and we'll end with Dr. Frankenstein talking about animating a scalpel. But before we get into this, very quickly, Susan, what is it that you do?
I'm a personal trainer and fitness.
Do you ever reanimate people from the dead?
I kill people according to my clients, but I don't know about the reanimation part.
There are probably a few that you've kept from needing reanimation.
Yeah.
So in this case, we're going to start off right into this. Let's just dive right in, because the previous minute, last Friday when we last left, we had Brainy Smurf once again putting on the Internet show. And we both said, Walt, I think that both of us wanted to punch him in the head.
Yeah, and I love the fact that this unnamed character we are now affectionately calling Brainy Smurf because he is so dadgum annoying.
He is annoying. When I watched that, all I wanted to do was smack him and say, man, he's annoying. So then when I did find out he was Brainy Smurf, I just said, that makes sense.
Well, and Dr. Ryan made a great point last week with us that we all know people like this. We've all had classes with people like this, the person who's got to make their way. And Brainy Smurf here just cannot stop himself from prodding Dr. Frankenstein.
Now, this was the question Walt and I both talked about it and said, surely a kid in medical school, the last thing you want to do is provoke your professor. But what Dr. Ryan told us, apparently, there's always at least one in every class.
Well, there's always that kid that needs to prove that they're better than the teacher or professor, and he certainly steps up to that.
All right, so he's introducing this story about this vermicelli worm, and apparently it is historically correct about this experiment where a worm supposedly was dead. We have no idea because this is, hundreds of years ago, and suddenly started to reanimate and continuing this whole thing that this kid's fixated on. Aren't you interested in bringing things back from the dead?
Well, and I really love Dr. Frankenstein's response. And there are really two things here that are crazy. Number one, he really continues to distance himself. And his response to him is, well, I read something about that while I was a medical student. And really puts him down, tries to put him in his place, but also to say, I'm really not interested in this whole reanimation thing. But it's also interesting to see the guy who's come from the Frankenstein family, whatever, that we're going to find out about, who's carrying the cigar box. He really perks up to see what Dr. Frankenstein's response is going to be to the reanimation issue.
Well, the thing that I found interesting is this kid has gone back to the first question, because remember, he started off with about your family, and then he's like, okay, fine, now explain to me, which led to the whole, Mr. Hilltop being brought in and getting kneed in the nads and then being wheeled out. But now he's right back to where he left off. He does not want to let this die.
Cannot let it die.
So when you found out, Susan, that this was the voiceover actor for Brainy Smurf, what were your first thoughts? Because you didn't know that coming into this minute.
It makes sense because when I was little and I watched the Smurfs, I always wanted to hit Brainy Smurf. He just annoyed the crap out of me, just like this kid. So I guess this actor must be typecast in that particular role. I mean, I'm curious what the casting call sounds like. We want a total jackball, a smarmy jackball. Apply if you fit that description.
Are you a complete horse's ass? We got the role for you.
Exactly.
Sign right here. Well, it made me, speaking of the Smurf reference, during this minute, I'm like, all right, somebody go get Gargamel and sick Azrael on this guy because I'm ready for him to just get his face scratched off. All right, so they continue the discussion, and he does at least humor him somewhat, but then the kid makes the point of saying, but wait a minute, what about hearts and kidneys? Obviously, we're in 1974. We're starting to see more pioneering in heart transplants where someone's heart has stopped, where you can actually take someone's heart from a dead person and transplant it into a person and reanimate it. He actually says those are tinker toys. I don't know. Those are pretty important organs, but it's amazing that in his mind, well, that's just a piece of tissue that has one function. It's not the central nervous system.
Yeah, and he had made the statement early on about the cutting off of the central nervous system and it can't be repaired. He is really doing everything he can to get away from that Frankenstein heritage and the whole issue of reanimation, but you can also tell that he has thought through this.
Right, and there is the picture of the diagram on the board behind him as he's saying this.
Yeah, here's what I think is interesting, is he's trying to stay really calm initially with this kid. He's like, okay, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to try to have a reasonable conversation with this kid. And even when he first puts him down about, with few exceptions, worms are not human beings, the class all laughs. Like you hear in the background, even though it's focused on Brainy Smurf, in the background you hear the whole class sort of giggling about, okay, that was pretty funny.
Yeah, and they kind of are taking pleasure in the fact that Dr. Frankenstein is getting his shots in.
Now, did you notice here in the next exchange, Brainy Smurf does sort of a hybrid of the name because he first calls him Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. And he gets corrected, Frankenstein. How does he say it? It's like it's a weird way. Frankenstein. So he basically takes the front half, kind of the same, and then still puts it's weird. It doesn't.
It's really
like he doesn't know how to say the guy's name properly because he keeps trying to want to say Frankenstein.
And it's that high-pitched, annoying Brainy Smurf voice.
Now, what do you think about the line, and Susan, I'll go to you first, because it is an oft-quoted line about, you talk about the nonsensical ravings of a lunatic mind. I mean, he's basically talking about his family history, but if there's any doubt, he wants to get away from it.
Right there. He's saying he's crazy. He's crazy. Why are you even thinking about this? He was crazy.
This is one of my favorite lines from the whole movie. I've used this with my kids. I've used this at work. I mean, this is a great line.
The nonsensical ravings of a lunatic mind. But he still actually one-ups it because in the next time he's talking about my grandfather's work was doo-doo.
Which is another great line.
And he's getting bent. He is. No doubt he is. He is on. He's like, I'm so done with this kid.
And this kid is pressing every one of his buttons.
Now, I do think this is interesting. And I think we said it early on that this script was actually much longer. And the first cut of the film was actually almost 50 to 60% longer than the final cut. They cut a lot out of the film that was in the script and stuff they filmed spontaneously on set. There's a scene here where, remember the orderly that stays behind with the coat? While this kid is saying this in the script that they shot, but they cut the scene, he actually whispers over his shoulder, I want this kid out of my classroom next semester. He's got a big mouth.
Yeah, you can see that without him ever saying it, too. He's done with him.
So apparently, I don't like this kid, you don't like this kid, and Susan, our guest, you don't like this medical student.
And Frankenstein doesn't like the medical student.
No,
I think
not
we're all agreed.
Yeah. All right, so let's look in the back of the room. As you said, we've got this guest who came in several minutes ago who's been attending the lecture. He seems very interested in this whole conversation, especially given that it's about the reanimation of the dead. But also he looks a little concerned when Dr. Frankenstein not only doesn't want to have anything to do with his family lineage, that he goes so far as to call his family crazy.
Yeah, and I don't know that we even have the answer to this, but I have wondered if he wanted Dr. Frankenstein to continue the work or if he was worried that he might continue the work. It's really hard to know which side he was falling on there. And it's also hard to tell why this is all being handed off to this member of the Frankenstein family.
We can get into that in the next minute. I have some answers for that, but it doesn't make sense to do it this minute. But no. I can tell you in the next minute, we will dive a little further into that whole idea of the lineage and is he really truly deserving of the name? And we'll find out from this visitor why he has come to visit this particular lecture. At the very end of this scene, Dr. Frankenstein makes a point of holding up a scalpel, and he says, you would have more luck reanimating this scalpel. And he stops because it's the end of the minute.
End of the minute.
But what was your first thought when he picks up the scalpel? Because he's already mad at this kid.
Well, the first time I saw this, I just thought, oh, he's going to come completely unglued. But, now watching it, you can see he really is, again, grasping at making this point that this is not workable. You cannot bring life back to life once it's dead. And you can also see him beginning to come unglued. And I think this is the genius, again, of Gene Wilder and his facial expressions and his manner in this minute. He plays this part so masterfully, and you really feel the energy beginning to tick up and the tension continuing to grow.
Susan, when you were in college, if your professor started to yell at you, would you continue having this kind of an argument?
I would shrink into a tiny little ball of tears if that happens.
I mean, he is going after this kid. Because I am here as a scientist. I am not here to discuss philosophy.
It's funny you talked about the scalpel. I could have so seen, because of the comedy and the type of movies that Gene Wilder has done, if in his rantings the scalpel had slipped out of his hands and flown at the student.
Mm-hmm.
That when I first went back to rewatch this, that was my initial thought, is I couldn't remember, does he throw it or does it come flying out of his hands? Because that's a gag that actually will show up much later in the movie.
Yes.
When he's ruffled, when somebody has distracting him and he's kept from that cool veneer that he's trying to portray. Easily flustered. I was waiting for it to go flying, maybe land in the skull, in the skeleton hanging behind him or something. But I was interested, like, why? Of all things, and I do think you're right. In some way, it is illustrative to say, here is a metal object. Everyone knows what it is. No matter how much you want to try, you can't make this thing come alive. But I think the fault in the logic here, well, it is an inanimate object. It was never alive. The kid is asking about reanimating dead tissue, not metal.
Right. It's not creating life from nothing, but the reanimation.
Well, I think he's just saying you would have just as much luck doing this because it's not going to happen. He was trying to overemphasize.
That's a good point. You're right. I mean, it's as silly as we're hoping that this could come to life as bringing something dead back to life. Right. Once it's dead, it's dead. I mean, he makes a point, I think, in the next minute about when you sever the central nervous system, that's it. You know, it's more complex than a heart or a kidney. We've got not much else actually in this minute to talk about, I don't think. I want to make sure we've covered everything. Susan, when you were watching this minute, getting ready for today's episode, any thoughts that you wanted to convey? Anything we didn't already cover?
No, the only thing, the biggest things in this scene were just that annoying Brainy Smurf.
The one thing that I thought last night when I was rewatching this minute is, if this was done today, how many people would block this jerk on Facebook? Because you know he's the one who is constantly stirring the pot.
That's right.
Yeah. If there were social media.
No, that Rate My Professor. My daughters, they use that all the time when signing up for classes. I could see he would be the type that would go in and write long things about this professor.
Yeah, and it would all be
negative.
It would all be negative. He would give every professor a 1, and his statement would be, this lunatic whose family destroyed a town by reanimating life won't reanimate life in our class, so I'm giving him a 1.
Right, yes.
That is an interesting point you bring up. He is trying so hard to make sure that everyone knows that's not science. That's not what he's all about. He's about the preservation of life. He's about understanding life, not trying to figure out how to bring life back into something that is now dead.
That's right. He is scientist, a medical professional. He is not outside the bounds of straight science, and that is where he is wanting. That is what he is wanting this class to understand. And I don't know why he didn't just give up on Brainy Smurf at some point here, but he is overemphasizing that.
All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up for this minute here of the Wilder Ride. But as we do, it's important for us to say a quick thank you to a couple of folks that actually helped get this whole idea started, and that's the guys from the Star Wars Minute, Pete and Alex of StarWarsMinute.com. They created that daily format, and we certainly appreciate all that they've done to kind of kick off this sort of podcast market.
Yes, and we also want to thank all the folks who've gone out to Facebook and liked us and are following us. We're just seeing the numbers of people grow like crazy on Facebook, and appreciate everybody going out to iTunes. We've gotten quite a few 5-star ratings and people making comments, and we really do appreciate that.
And, of course, our website, pretty easy to remember. It's thewilderride.com. Links to all of our social media there, and you can learn a little bit more about us and about the guests that we have had and are scheduled to have, depending on when you stumble across this particular podcast. Sometimes people don't find these until months after they first launch.
Yeah, and if you want to help us out in another tangible way, you can go to www.patreon.com/thewilderride. Even if you want to help us out with $1 a month, we would really appreciate it, and we really do appreciate the folks who've stepped up and helped us out there.
And tomorrow, we will be back with another episode of Young Frankenstein, where we find out what's going on with the use of the scalpel in his hand, and where does it lead, and does the guy in the back of the room eventually have anything to say? Susan, you want to join us again tomorrow for our podcast?
I had a great time. I'd love to.
All right. Well, we will have you back tomorrow. That's it, everybody. Have a great time. And I guess we'll do in honor of Brainy Smurf, Frankenstein. Frankenstein.
Brainy Smurf.
Whatever.
You gotta wind it up a little bit.
Frankenstein.